In the year 1558, a crowned queen ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Her face was stamped on royal seals. Her name was spoken in cathedrals. Her authority was law. And then, within a single year, she vanished. Her portraits were burned. Her coins were melted. Her name was cut out of official records as if she had never existed. How do you erase a queen from history? And more importantly, who was powerful enough to do it?
History remembers kings. It remembers wars. It remembers bloodlines. But sometimes history forgets on purpose. For centuries, scholars studying the Tudor dynasty in England believed the line of succession was simple. Henry VIII, then his son Edward VI, followed by his daughter Mary I, and finally the legendary Elizabeth I. 4 rulers, 4 names. But that wasn't the whole story. Between Edward and Mary, for 9 brief days, there was another monarch, a queen. Her name was Lady Jane Grey. Today, most people know her as the 9 Days Queen, a tragic teenager caught in political chaos. But what most history books barely mention is that after she was executed, the government didn't just remove her from power, they tried to remove her from existence. Official proclamations declared her rule illegal. Chroniclers were ordered to rewrite their accounts. Her claim was dismissed as treason. For generations, her name appeared in footnotes, if it appeared at all. It was as if England itself had decided to pretend she had never worn the crown. But she had. And for 9 days in July 1553, she was the most powerful woman in the kingdom. To understand how a teenage girl became queen and why the crown destroyed her, we have to step back into one of the most dangerous royal courts in European history. The court of Henry VIII was not just a palace, it was a battlefield. Alliances shifted like sand, marriages were weapons, religion divided the country, and survival depended on loyalty or perfect timing. Jane Grey was born into this storm in 1537, the same year Edward VI entered the world. England was unstable. The Protestant Reformation had shattered religious unity. Executions were public, accusations were deadly. From childhood, Jane was different. Highly educated, fluent in Greek and Latin, deeply committed to Protestant reform. In an era when most noblewomen were trained for marriage, she was trained for scholarship. But brilliance in Tudor England could be dangerous, because knowledge meant influence, and influence meant threat. As King Edward grew sickly in his teenage years, the question that haunted the kingdom returned with terrifying urgency. Who would inherit the throne? By law, after Edward, the crown should have passed to his Catholic half-sister, Mary I. But Edward was Protestant, his advisors were Protestant, and they feared that if Mary became queen, she would undo everything they had built. There was another option, a young, intelligent, devout Protestant girl with royal blood, Jane Grey. What happened next was not fate. It was strategy. Secret meetings, altered succession documents, powerful men whispering behind locked doors, a dying king persuaded to sign away his sister's rights. And in July 1553, without warning, Jane was told she was queen. She didn't ask for it, she didn't expect it. In fact, some accounts say she fainted when she heard the news. But the machinery of power was already moving. 9 days later, it would crush her, and centuries later, history would nearly forget her. This is not just the story of a teenage queen. It's the story of a royal conspiracy powerful enough to rewrite history itself. And it begins in a palace where trust was fatal and a crown could cost you your life.
Long before she was queen, before soldiers guarded her doors and nobles bowed in forced loyalty, Jane Grey was simply a girl born into privilege and pressure. She entered the world in 1537, into a powerful aristocratic family with royal blood flowing quietly through its veins. Through her grandmother, she was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. That made her a distant cousin to the ruling Tudor children, including Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Royal blood, but far enough away from the throne that she was never meant to sit on it. Or so everyone thought. Jane grew up at Bradgate Park, surrounded by wealth, books, and relentless expectations. Unlike many noble girls of her time, she received an extraordinary education. Tutors praised her intelligence. She read Plato in Greek. She translated the New Testament in Latin. She debated theology with confidence that surprised grown scholars. One visitor, the scholar Roger Ascham, described her as one of the most learned young women in England. But behind that brilliance was something darker. Jane's parents were ambitious. In Tudor England, ambition was currency. Families rose or fell based on proximity to power, and Jane was valuable, not because she wanted to rule, but because she could be used. Her childhood wasn't filled with freedom, it was filled with discipline. She later admitted she preferred the quiet company of books over courtly dances and hunting parties. When she made mistakes, punishments were harsh. Excellence wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. By the time she entered the royal court as a teenager, Jane was already shaped into something rare, a devout Protestant intellectual in a kingdom deeply divided by religion. And religion in Tudor England wasn't just belief, it was survival. To understand why Jane became queen, you have to understand the chaos inside England. When Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, he didn't just change religion, he shattered centuries of tradition. Monasteries were dissolved, wealth shifted, loyalties fractured. After Henry's death, his only legitimate son, Edward VI, took the throne in 1547 at just 9 years old, a child king, which meant the real power sat in the hands of advisors. England became more aggressively Protestant under Edward's reign. Catholic practices were stripped away. Latin Mass was replaced with English services. Reform moved quickly, and not everyone agreed. Among the most powerful men at court was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, ambitious, calculating, politically sharp. He understood something most people didn't. Edward was sick. By early 1553, the teenage king's health was failing. Tuberculosis, historians believe. His body weakened, his coughing worsened, and with every labored breath, England moved closer to a crisis. Because by law, the next in line was his half-sister, Mary I. Mary was Catholic. If she became queen, she would likely reverse Protestant reforms. Men like Northumberland could lose power, or worse. So they searched for an alternative, someone with Tudor blood, someone Protestant, someone young enough to influence. And their eyes turned to Jane. But before the plan could unfold, they needed one more move: a marriage. In May 1553, Jane Grey was married to Guildford Dudley, the son of the Duke of Northumberland. It was not a love story. It was strategy. The wedding was grand, filled with celebration, silk gowns, music echoing through stone halls. But beneath the festivities was something colder: calculation. By marrying his son to Jane, Northumberland positioned his family within reach of the throne. If Jane became queen, Guildford would become king consort, and Northumberland would become the power behind them both. But Jane did not know the full plan.
At the same time, King Edward's condition was worsening, confined to bed, pale, thin, surrounded by anxious advisers. The young king, deeply Protestant himself, feared what would happen to his religious reforms if Mary ruled. Northumberland saw his opportunity. He encouraged Edward to draft a new succession plan, a document later known as the Devise for the Succession. In it, Edward bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth, declaring them illegitimate due to the complicated marriages of their father, Henry VIII. Instead, he named Lady Jane and her male heirs as successors. It was bold, it was legally questionable, and it was dangerous. Convincing a dying king to change the line of succession wasn't just political maneuvering. It bordered on treason. But Edward signed. Whether out of conviction, persuasion, or pressure, we may never know. On July 6, 1553, King Edward VI died. England did not yet know. For 3 days his death was kept secret. Behind closed doors, plans were finalized, letters were drafted, troops were positioned. The machinery of a coup quietly began to move. And Jane Grey was still unaware. Until July 9th, she was summoned to Sion House. Surrounded by powerful men, including her parents and Northumberland, she was told the king was dead, and that she was now Queen of England. Accounts say she collapsed in shock. She protested, she argued she was not the rightful heir, that the crown belonged to Mary, but the men around her insisted. The kingdom depended on her. God had chosen her. It was her duty. In reality, the decision had already been made. On July 10, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. Church bells rang, official announcements were read aloud, and for 9 extraordinary days, a 16-year-old girl wore a crown she never wanted. But outside the palace walls, another force was rising. Mary Tudor was still alive, and she was not surrendering her birthright.
On July 10, 1553, London awoke to a shocking announcement. King Edward VI was dead, and Lady Jane Grey was queen. Messengers rode through the streets reading official proclamations. Trumpets echoed across the city. The Tower of London, the traditional residence of monarchs before coronation, opened its gates to receive its newest ruler. Jane entered not as a prisoner, but as a queen. Inside the stone walls of the tower, noblemen bowed. Formal oaths were taken. Documents were sealed with her name. Orders were issued in her authority. For a brief moment, it seemed the plan had worked. But something was wrong. The crowds were quiet. In Tudor England, the public response to a new monarch was usually loud and unmistakable. Cheers, celebrations, church bells ringing in unity. This time, there was hesitation, whispers, confusion. Many Londoners knew the law. By the Third Succession Act, the rightful heir after Edward was Mary I, and Mary was alive. Even more dangerous, she was free. When news of Edward's death reached her, Mary did not wait. She fled to East Anglia, where she had strong Catholic support and loyal noble allies. From there, she declared herself the true Queen of England. Letters spread quickly across the country. Noble families were forced to choose sides. Jane had the crown. Mary had legitimacy. Within days, thousands rallied to Mary's cause. Armed men gathered. Influential lords defected from Jane's camp. Even members of the Privy Council, the same men who had declared Jane queen, began to panic. At the center of the storm stood John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. He knew time was running out. If Mary's support continued to grow, Jane's reign would collapse. So he made a bold decision. He would lead an army himself to capture Mary. But when he left London, he made a fatal mistake. He left Jane behind, in the Tower, surrounded by men whose loyalty depended entirely on which side would win. And as Northumberland marched away, the tide began to turn. Inside the Tower of London, Jane tried to rule, but the truth was brutal. She had the title, she did not have control. Guildford Dudley, her husband, demanded to be crowned king alongside her. He believed marriage entitled him to the title. Jane refused. She insisted he would be duke, nothing more. Even at 16, she understood something critical. If she surrendered that authority, she would be nothing more than a figurehead. The refusal created tension within her own household. Her in-laws were furious. Her parents pressured her. Court politics, even in crisis, did not pause. Meanwhile, reports from the countryside grew worse. Mary's forces were expanding. Nobles who had initially supported Jane began quietly withdrawing. Merchants in London hesitated to finance Northumberland's campaign. Soldiers questioned orders. Religion played a powerful role. Mary symbolized a return to Catholic tradition. For many common people, especially outside London, that was comforting. Jane represented Protestant reform and uncertainty. On July 19th, just 9 days after Jane was proclaimed queen, the Privy Council made its decision. They switched sides. In a stunning act of political survival, they abandoned Jane and declared Mary the rightful queen. Church bells rang again across London. This time, the cheers were real. In the Tower, Jane was informed that her reign was over. No coronation, no crown placed upon her head. 9 days, that was all. Guards entered her chambers, not to serve her, but to confine her. The Tower of London had transformed from royal residence to prison. And Jane Grey, once proclaimed Queen of England, was now a prisoner of the very crown she had worn.
John Dudley never reached Mary. As news spread that the Privy Council had recognized her claim, his army dissolved. Soldiers deserted. Allies vanished. The momentum he had carefully constructed collapsed almost overnight. He was arrested, brought back to London, charged with high treason. In a final act of desperation, Northumberland publicly converted to Catholicism, hoping to earn mercy from the new queen, Mary I. It didn't save him. He was executed on August 22, 1553. The architect of the conspiracy was gone. But what about the girl he had placed on the throne? When Mary entered London as queen, the streets exploded with celebration. Crowds cheered. Church bells rang without hesitation. The kingdom believed legitimacy had been restored. Mary faced a choice. Jane Grey was technically guilty of treason. She had accepted the crown. Official documents bore her name. But she was also a teenager, manipulated by powerful men. At first, Mary showed restraint. Jane and her husband Guildford were imprisoned in the Tower, but not immediately sentenced to death. There was even discussion of mercy. Mary understood something important. Executing Jane could make her a Protestant martyr, and martyrdom could be dangerous. For several months, Jane remained alive in her cell. She read scripture. She debated theology with Catholic visitors. She refused to renounce her Protestant faith. Outside the Tower walls, however, England remained unstable. Religious tension simmered. And then, in early 1554, rebellion erupted. Sir Thomas Wyatt led an uprising against Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain. The rebellion was crushed, but its existence terrified the Queen. And in the chaos, Jane's name resurfaced. Rebels had used her as a symbol. As long as she lived,
she could be used again. This time, mercy vanished. Mary signed the execution warrant. On February 12, 1554, Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, was led to the scaffold inside the Tower of London. She was 16 years old. Blindfolded, she reportedly struggled to find the execution block, whispering, "What shall I do? Where is it?" Moments later, the axe fell. The conspiracy had failed. But the erasure was only beginning, because killing a queen is one thing. Making the world forget she ever ruled, that required something far more deliberate. Execution silenced Jane Grey's voice, but it did not erase the danger she represented. Queen Mary I understood something terrifyingly clear. Revolutions don't need living leaders. They only need symbols. And Jane, even in death, was a symbol. A Protestant queen, a rival claim, a reminder that Mary's throne had once trembled. So the campaign shifted from punishment to disappearance. Official records were adjusted. Proclamations declared Jane's reign unlawful, not merely brief, but illegitimate. Legal documents described her as a usurper. Chroniclers softened the language around Mary's rise, framing it not as a contested succession, but as a rightful restoration. In some royal lists, Jane's name was removed entirely. In others, she was reduced to a footnote. Coins minted during her 9 days were collected and destroyed. Seals bearing her authority were melted down. Any official paper that recognized her as queen was quietly replaced or rewritten. The goal was subtle but powerful. If her reign was illegal, then it never truly happened. History is not only written by victors, it is edited by them. And in the Tudor court, shaped by the brutal precedent of Henry VIII, controlling the narrative was essential to survival. Mary also launched a broader religious restoration. Catholicism returned as the official faith. Protestant leaders were arrested. Some were burned at the stake, a campaign that would later earn her the nickname Bloody Mary. In this environment, sympathy for Jane became dangerous. To publicly defend her was to question the queen. So silence spread, and silence, over time, becomes forgetting. But despite the erasure, something stubborn remained. Foreign ambassadors had written reports. Private letters had been copied. Whispers survived, and they told a more complicated story. The official narrative under Mary was simple. Jane Grey had been manipulated by traitors. She had unlawfully claimed the throne. Justice had been served. Clean, final, controlled. But history rarely stays obedient. Records from foreign diplomats, especially from the Holy Roman Empire and France, describe confusion in England during July 1553. They mention Jane as queen. They detail public uncertainty. They describe Mary gathering forces in the countryside. These documents were outside Mary's reach. They couldn't be burned or rewritten. And they confirmed one undeniable fact. Jane had ruled, even if briefly, even if unwillingly. Over the centuries, historians began piecing together fragments. The devise for the succession, signed by Edward VI, still existed. Legal arguments surfaced, showing how controversial the succession change truly was. Some scholars argued Edward acted independently, driven by religious conviction. Others insisted he was heavily pressured by Northumberland. And then came another haunting question. Did Mary truly believe Jane deserved death, or was she forced into it by political necessity? Mary's position was fragile. She was England's first queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, not as a wife. Her authority was already being tested. A rival claimant alive inside the tower was a risk she could not afford. In Tudor politics, mercy could look like weakness, and weakness invited rebellion. Jane's execution, then, may not have been cruelty. It may have been calculation. Still, calculation does not soften tragedy. Jane had been crowned against her will, used as a pawn, abandoned by the men who placed her on the throne, and finally executed to stabilize a kingdom that never truly belonged to her. But if Mary thought killing Jane would end the threat, history had other plans. When Mary I died in 1558 without an heir, the crown passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, a Protestant, reversed many of Mary's Catholic reforms. Under her long and powerful reign, England stabilized. The Elizabethan era flourished, exploration expanded, culture thrived, and the memory of Jane Grey quietly resurfaced. Protestant writers began portraying her differently, not as a usurper, but as a martyr, a young woman sacrificed for her faith. Paintings depicted her pale and innocent, dressed in white, moments before execution. Her image transformed, from illegal queen to tragic heroine. But even then, her reign remained awkward. Official monarch lists still moved cleanly from Edward VI to Mary I. Jane hovered in between, recognized but not fully acknowledged, a queen without a coronation, a monarch without a dynasty, a ruler whose authority lasted 9 days, but whose story lasted centuries. And here lies the deeper conspiracy. The attempt to erase Jane Grey did not completely succeed, but it worked just enough. Ask most people to name the monarchs of Tudor England, and they will list Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I. 4 names, clean, orderly, simple. And in that simplicity, a teenage queen almost disappears. But history is rarely simple. It is layered, political, human. Jane Grey's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power does not only decide who rules, it decides who is remembered. And sometimes the most dangerous act in a kingdom isn't rebellion, it's being forgotten.
Erasing a queen was not done in a single dramatic moment. It was done slowly, carefully, officially. After Jane's execution, the Tudor government did not announce that she had been removed from history. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they adjusted the record in subtle bureaucratic ways. Royal genealogies were simplified. Succession lists moved directly from Edward VI to Mary I. Legal scholars avoided recognizing her proclamations. Decrees issued in her name were invalidated. Any oath sworn to Queen Jane was treated as though it had never legally existed. Even the physical symbols of her authority were targeted. Royal seals bearing her initials were destroyed. Coins minted during her brief reign were recalled and melted down. Portraits that may have been commissioned were never widely displayed or quietly disappeared. The message was clear. Jane was not a queen. She was an interruption, and interruptions are corrected. But the most powerful tool of erasure wasn't fire or melting metal. It was narrative control. Under Mary's reign, official chroniclers described Jane not as Queen Jane, but as the Lady Jane. A subtle difference, but one with enormous political weight. Titles define legitimacy. Remove the title, and you weaken the claim. And in a world where most people learned history through church sermons and royal proclamations, repetition mattered. If you hear something often enough, it becomes truth. By the time Elizabeth I took the throne, Jane's story had already been reshaped into something manageable, a tragic detour in the grand Tudor narrative. But the Tudor court underestimated something. Paper survives. Letters survive. And sometimes, so do questions. Centuries later, historians began to notice inconsistencies.
Foreign ambassadors stationed in London during July 1553 had written detailed reports back to their governments. These dispatches described Jane being proclaimed queen. They documented the tension in the capital. They even recorded public reactions. These were not Tudor-controlled documents. They were independent witnesses, and they confirmed that Jane's reign, however brief, was real. Then came the Devise for the Succession, the document drafted under Edward VI. Handwritten revisions showed last-minute changes. Legal scholars debated whether Edward had the authority to alter the line of succession established by Parliament. Some experts argue Edward acted out of deep Protestant conviction. He feared England would return to Catholicism under Mary. Others suggest heavy influence, even coercion by Northumberland and powerful Protestant advisors. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What became increasingly clear, however, was that Jane had not orchestrated her rise. She had not campaigned for the throne. She had not built alliances. She was placed there. Even her personal writings reveal reluctance. In letters written during imprisonment, she emphasized her innocence in the political maneuvering. She framed her role as obedience to family, to counsel, to what she believed was lawful authority at the time. Over time, scholars began reassessing her not as a failed usurper, but as a pawn in a high-stakes power struggle. And that realization shifts the story dramatically. Because if Jane was not the architect of the conspiracy, then who truly was? At the center of it all stands one towering figure, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Ambitious, strategic, ruthless when necessary. But even he was not acting alone. The Tudor court in 1553 was divided not just by personal ambition, it was divided by religion, inheritance, and fear of instability. The Protestant elite had invested years into reshaping England's faith. If Mary I reversed those reforms, fortunes and lives could be destroyed. Northumberland saw an opportunity in Edward's failing health, but he also saw a threat in Mary's survival. By marrying his son to Jane and persuading Edward to alter the succession, he attempted something extraordinary, a controlled transfer of power that preserved Protestant rule and strengthened his own family's position. It was bold, it was desperate, and it depended entirely on speed. What Northumberland miscalculated was Mary herself. Mary was politically sharper than many had assumed. She moved quickly. She rallied support. She appealed not only to Catholic loyalty, but to legality. She positioned herself as the rightful heir under the law established by her father, Henry VIII. In doing so, she framed Jane's reign not as a religious alternative, but as rebellion. That framing was crucial, because rebellion justifies punishment, and punishment justifies erasure. The conspiracy, then, was not just about placing Jane on the throne. It was about controlling the future of England. Religion, power, dynasty, all compressed into 9 explosive days. And when it failed, those responsible were executed. But the easiest person to erase was not the Duke who planned it. It was the teenage girl who symbolized it. Jane Grey became both victim and warning, a reminder that in royal courts, innocence offers no protection. And in the battle for history, the pen can be as sharp as the axe. After her fall from power, Jane Grey's world shrank to the stone walls of the Tower of London. The same palace where she had briefly worn the crown now became a prison. The grandeur of royalty was replaced with isolation, and the weight of politics pressed on her young shoulders. Letters from friends and family were carefully censored, and Jane had little contact with the outside world. She spent her days reading the Bible, praying and reflecting on the whirlwind that had brought her from scholar to queen to prisoner. Despite her fear, she remained composed. Witnesses later described her as calm and dignified, even in the face of imminent death. In her letters, she wrote of her innocence, her loyalty to God, and her willingness to accept her fate, not as a guilty traitor, but as a pawn in a game far larger than herself. In early 1554, the political climate shifted once again. The uprising led by Sir Thomas Wyatt in protest of Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain had briefly threatened the throne. Jane's name surfaced in connection to the rebellion, not because she participated, but because she could serve as a rallying figure for discontented Protestants. Mary first could no longer tolerate the risk. A decision was made. Jane Grey and her husband, Guildford Dudley, would be executed. On February 12, 1554, Jane was led to the scaffold inside the Tower. Contemporary accounts paint a haunting picture: a girl of 16, blindfolded, trembling, yet dignified. She reportedly struggled to find the block, whispering, "What shall I do? Where is it?" And then the executioner struck. The 9 Days' Queen, a symbol of political intrigue, religious tension, and ambition, was gone. Her life ended far too early, and her reign had lasted less than 2 weeks. Yet even in death, Jane Grey would not be allowed to remain fully in history. After Jane's execution, the Tudor government took deliberate steps to erase her reign. Royal records were rewritten. Succession lists omitted her name. Coins and official seals were destroyed or recalled. Chroniclers were instructed to depict her as a usurper and focus attention on Mary I's rightful claim. The world was to remember Jane Grey as nothing more than a tragic footnote. Her brief authority would be minimized, her accomplishments hidden, and her life reshaped into a cautionary narrative. Yet traces remained. Foreign ambassadors had recorded her reign. Letters survived, describing her courage and intellect. Scholars, centuries later, discovered legal documents, drafts of Edward VI's succession plan, and contemporary accounts that confirmed she had truly been queen. History had tried to forget her, but facts endure. Jane's story is more than tragedy. It is a lens into how power can manipulate memory. Those in authority control not just events, but how events are remembered and forgotten. In removing her from the narrative, the Tudors demonstrated a chilling truth. History is written not only by victors, but by those who survive politically. Jane Grey's life is a haunting reminder of how fragile power can be and how easily history can be rewritten. She was intelligent, devout, and willing to serve, yet her youth made her vulnerable. She was used by ambitious men, yet she carried herself with dignity. She briefly ruled a kingdom, yet her story nearly vanished from memory. Her experience illustrates the deadly intersection of politics, religion, and ambition in Tudor England. But it also reveals the resilience of truth. Despite attempts to erase her, Jane Grey is remembered today as a symbol of courage, intellect, and innocence caught in the crossfire of history. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other voices have been silenced? How many rulers, scholars, and citizens have been erased from history simply because they threatened the status quo? In studying Jane Grey, we are reminded that history is not merely a list of dates and names. It is the story of human ambition, courage, and betrayal, and sometimes the cost of speaking truth in a dangerous world. The 9 Days' Queen may have been erased, but her story survives. And through it, we glimpse the power of one life to challenge the course of a kingdom, even if only for 9 unforgettable days.
Centuries after her death, Jane Grey's story began to re-emerge from the shadows. Scholars poring over Tudor documents noticed gaps, references to a queen who ruled briefly but mysteriously vanished from the official record. Archaeologists and historians uncovered letters, personal diaries, and legal drafts that painted a fuller picture of her life. They discovered that she had been far more than a pawn, a brilliant, devout, and courageous young woman thrust into circumstances beyond her control. Modern portraits and artistic reconstructions show a girl of 16, dignified yet fragile, wearing a crown she neither sought nor desired. Museums today preserve her memory, and books retell her story as more than tragedy, as a warning about power, manipulation, and the fragility of truth. Yet even with modern recognition, a question remains. How does a kingdom allow a queen to be erased? How many other figures in history have been quietly removed because they challenged authority, religion, or politics? Jane Grey's life, though short, forces us to confront the fragility of memory and the power of influence. A teenager crowned at 16, executed at 16, and yet immortalized because her story refuses to be silenced. Her reign lasted 9 days, but the lessons she left last forever. Power can be fleeting. Innocence can be dangerous. History is never neutral. It is written by those who survive. As you think about Jane Grey today, remember this. Kingdoms can erase names from documents, rulers can rewrite laws, and chroniclers can lie. But the truth often finds a way to survive. If a teenage queen could almost be erased from history, how many other voices have been lost forever? The 9 Days Queen reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles. It is about the people caught between ambition and destiny, and about the fragile thread that separates memory from oblivion. Her story is a warning. Her story is a legacy, and her story will never be forgotten.